You think you could have been a medieval barmaid? Think again. The movies have us all fooled. We imagine a bustling tavern, endless mugs of ale, and a charming, witty hero's journey in a cool corset. We believe the biggest danger was a rogue dragon or a grumpy king. But what if I told you that the most brutal, terrifying, and demanding job in the entire Middle Ages wasn't being a knight, a king, or a soldier? It was being a simple barmaid. This isn't just about serving drinks. It's about surviving a reality far more horrifying than any fantasy. Forget what you think you know. In the next 2 hours, we're going to peel back the romantic lies and reveal a secret history you won't find in any textbook. This isn't just a video, it's a deep dive into a dark, visceral world where your survival depended not on courage, but on wit, resilience, and a willingness to endure. We're going to step into the past and explore the life of a woman who was a walking paradox. A public figure who had no voice, a confidant with no friends, and a therapist who carried more trauma than her patrons. The kind of knowledge you're about to gain will permanently change how you see the past, because the true story is not just more complex, but infinitely more valuable. And the real horror began, not at the end of the night, when the patrons staggered out, but at the very start of the day. And there you have it. The full, unvarnished story of a medieval barmaid. It's a story of endurance, quiet strength, and a kind of brutal resilience you won't read in any history book. Her life wasn't a fantasy. It was a daily struggle for survival, a testament to the unwritten, unseen reality of a world that didn't care about her. If you found this deep dive into the past valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Hitting that notification bell helps me continue to uncover these hidden stories and share them with you. Now, I'd like to hear from you. Comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is for you. I'm fascinated by the idea of this story of the past reaching across time and connecting with so many people in the present. Man, talk about a rude awakening. You know that feeling when you've had a rough night and the sun just seems to show up way too early. Now multiply that by like 1,000. That was your life as a medieval barmaid. There was no snooze button, no gentle alarm clock. The second the first sliver of light hit the grime-covered window, you were up. It was a daily ritual. Nod to gods, Kumtashwats. And Caldes of my owls came murting away from this house, not crash. You'd feel that icy cold seep into your bones, a chilling reminder that the party was over, but your work was just beginning. Imagine pulling yourself out of a lumpy straw mattress, your body screaming from the aches and pains of a night on your feet. You could still hear the echoes of laughter and spilled secrets, but the reality was a whole lot uglier. The floorboards, slick and sticky, with who knows what, felt like a trap. That's when the true horror would hit you. It was a sensory assault. The smell of stale ale, vomit and unwashed bodies would hit you full force, a pungent cocktail that seemed to cling to your very soul. You'd have to take a deep breath, steel yourself, and get on with it. The mop was your best friend and your worst enemy. You'd have to navigate through the chaos of overturned benches and scattered mugs, each one a testament to the night's revelry. But it wasn't just ale spills. Oh no. There were bloodstains, the lingering dark red of a fist fight that ended with a broken nose. There were patches of old stew, probably from some poor soul who couldn't hold his liquor, now caked on the floor like a medieval painting. The medieval barmaid life was not for the faint of heart. That's for sure. You had to have a strong stomach. And the smells. Good Lord, the smells. They weren't just a nuisance. They were a living, breathing thing. A character in their own right. The sour tang of spoiled ale would mix with the coppery scent of blood and the earthy stench of mud and dirt, tracked in from outside. It was a concoction that could make your eyes water. You'd try to get it all up, but you knew it was a losing battle. The scent was a permanent resident, a ghost of the night before, a grim reminder of your purpose. Your hands already raw and chapped from the cold, and the constant scrubbing would get even worse. The coarse bristles of the broom would scrape against your skin, and the freezing water from the well would make your joints ache. You'd have to get down on your hands and knees, feeling the splinters and the cold, hard wood against your palms to scrub at some stubborn stain. It was a kind of pain you got used to, a dull throb that was as much a part of your morning as the sunrise. You'd find yourself wishing for a moment's respite, a quiet corner to catch your breath. Even the simple act of eating was a grim affair. You wouldn't find a warm meal waiting for you. Breakfast was whatever was left over from the night before, and more often than not, it was a piece of rock-hard bread. And to make it even more appetizing, you'd dunk it into some leftover flat beer from a patron's mug. It sounds gross, I know, but it was the only way to soften it enough to chew. It's a taste I can still remember, a bittersweet mix of nourishment and pure disgust. The medieval barmaid got used to it, though. You had to. This was your existence. A never-ending cycle of chaos and clean-up. There was no time to mourn the dead of last night's brawl. No moment to reflect on the stories you overheard. Your job was to erase the evidence and prepare for the next round. Quiet of the morning was deceiving. It was a tense silence, a hushed anticipation of the noise that would inevitably fill the space again. It was as if the tavern itself was holding its breath, waiting for the doors to open and the madness to begin anew. You'd be working against the clock. The merchants would be up soon, and they'd want their morning ale before they went off to the market. The soldiers would come in for a stiff drink before their duties. The tavern had to be ready. You'd wipe the tables with a damp rag, feeling the rough texture of the wood under your hand, and you'd imagine the stories those same tables could tell. The laughter, the tears, the secrets whispered in the dark. It was a kind of a sad and beautiful tapestry, and you were its caretaker. It was a job that aged you faster than you could imagine. Constant stress, the lack of proper food, the bone-deep weariness, it all added up. You'd look at yourself in a tiny cracked piece of glass and barely recognize the girl who walked into the tavern. The dark circles under your eyes told a story all on their own. The medieval barmaid was a different breed of hero, one who fought with a mop and a bucket, not a sword. Her battles were quiet. Her victories were small, and her wounds were invisible. And the isolation. You were surrounded by people all day and night, but you were fundamentally alone. You were a tool for them, a face to smile, a hand to serve. You'd have friends among them. You had customers. The cold of the morning was a good metaphor for the loneliness you felt. It was a kind of numbing emptiness that you had to learn to live with. You'd find yourself talking to the silent, lifeless objects of the tavern, the tables, the chairs, the mugs, and they would be your only audience. The one comfort was the stillness of it all. For a few brief moments you had the place to yourself. The air was thick with the scent of yesterday's sins, but at least there were no people. Just you and the ghosts of the night. You'd stand there taking a moment to feel the chill on your skin, the silence in your ears, a brief respite before the onslaught. You could almost feel the weight of all those forgotten stories in the air, a kind of heavy nostalgia for a life you were never meant to have. As the sun crept higher, a strange thought would enter your mind. You'd think about the last person who left, maybe a traveller who was passing through. You wonder what their life was like, where they were headed, if they had a family waiting for them. And then you'd see a small, glinting object on the floor under a table. A forgotten coin, or maybe something more. A glinting mystery you'd have to pick up and examine. You had no idea what it was, but the story behind it, that was for the next person to uncover. Listen, let's get real for a minute. You might think about corsets and low-cut dresses as something from a fantasy book, all elegant and alluring. But for a medieval barmaid, that uniform wasn't about fashion. It was a tool, a sad, restrictive, and frankly painful tool. It was a visual cue, a harsh reality you were forced into every single morning, a second skin that didn't just hurt your body, but bruised your spirit. The tight laces would dig into your ribs, making it hard to take a deep breath, a constant pressure that was a physical manifestation of the mental pressure you were under. And why? Simple economics, really. Your appearance was directly tied to your income. The patrons, a motley crew of farmers, soldiers and merchants, weren't there for a masterclass in mixology. They were there for an escape, for a bit of company, and for a view. Your value wasn't in your speed or your wit, it was in how much you could show. That low-cut neckline wasn't an option. It was a demand. You'd see it in their eyes, the way they'd look at you, not as a person, but as a piece of the scenery, a part of the medieval barmaid experience they'd paid for. You'd notice a pattern. A patron would look you up and down, and the bigger the smile on their face, the more the tip. It was a subtle, and yet brutally obvious, transaction. You could serve the most perfect foaming mug of ale, but if you weren't presenting properly, you'd get a meagre coin, or worse, a lecherous wink, and nothing else. But if you leaned over just so, or let the laces loosen a bit, you'd get a better tip. The system was rigged, a twisted game where the rules were unwritten, but everyone understood them perfectly. It was a kind of constant, low-level humiliation. If you tried to dress more modestly, maybe covering up a little with a high-necked blouse, the regulars would notice. You'd hear the whispers and the snickers. "What? Is she getting pious now?" they'd say. Or the worst insult of all, they would simply ignore you, turning their attention to a more accommodating barmaid. The unspoken message was clear. Your dignity was a luxury you couldn't afford. The texture of the rough linen against your skin felt like a scratchy reminder of this cold reality. The objectification wasn't something that might happen. It was the entire premise of the job. It was a core part of the tavern life. You were a living, breathing advertisement. The air, thick with the smell of smoke and stale ale, was also charged with a kind of predatory energy. You'd feel their eyes on you like a physical weight, a constant pressure that never let up. It was a feeling you had to get used to, a kind of internal shield you had to build, piece by brutal piece. It was your only protection. You develop a kind of sixth sense. You'd know when someone was about to make a crude comment or reach out a hand. You'd learn to move your body in a way that offered just enough of a view to get a tip, but not so much that you invited a slap. It was a delicate, dangerous dance. The cold, wet mug you held in your hand was your only anchor in a world that was constantly trying to pull you under. You'd grip it so tight your knuckles would turn white, a small act of defiance. And the talk. Oh, the talk. True jokes, the comments about your cleavage, the sly remarks about what you'd do for an extra coin. You had to smile and pretend it was all just harmless fun. You'd feel that familiar flush of shame creeping up your neck, but you couldn't let it show. You had to master the art of the blank face, the vacant smile, a mask that hid the churning emotions underneath. The sound of their laughter felt like a physical blow. It was a silent kind of trauma, the kind that built up over time. It wasn't just a single event. It was a constant daily erosion of your self-worth. It was the feeling of being reduced to a single feature, of having your body on display like a piece of meat. You'd feel a dull ache in your chest, a sense of heavy sadness that you couldn't quite place. It was the weight of 100 leering stares, 1,000 crude jokes. The medieval barmaid wasn't just a server. She was a survivor of a constant battle for respect that she was destined to lose. But you learned to survive, didn't you? You learned to compartmentalize. You'd go into a kind of trance serving the drinks, wiping the tables, your body on autopilot, your mind somewhere else entirely. You'd find refuge in the small tasks, the methodical act of refilling a mug, the satisfying clink of a coin in your hand. This simple act of repetition was your anchor, a way to ground yourself when you felt like you were floating away from your own body. You had to become an expert at deflection. A customer would make a lewd comment, and you'd just nod and move on to the next order. A hand would linger too long, and you'd simply pull away, keeping your expression neutral. The barmaid was a master of the art of the dodge. You had to be. Your livelihood depended on it. It was a game of inches, of subtle movements, of a kind of practiced ignorance that was your only defence. Sometimes in the dead of the night, when the tavern was finally quiet, and the moon shone through the dusty window, you'd unlace your corset. You'd feel that glorious, painful rush of air as your lungs finally expanded. It was the only moment of true freedom you had all day. You'd run your hands over the red marks, the laces left on your skin, a physical map of your day's work. The cold air on your skin was a welcome shock, a fleeting moment of relief before the whole brutal cycle would start over again. You'd look at the uniform lying on the floor, a heap of fabric and string, and you'd hate it, but you'd also know that it was your only way to get by. It was your key to survival, a sad reality that you had to accept. As you drifted off to sleep, you'd think about a time when you could dress for yourself, not for the pleasure of others. A time when you could be a person, not a costume. You could almost feel the soft texture of a different kind of dress, one that covered you fully, a whisper of a future that may never arrive. Let's dive into the grimy reality of it. You've got the uniform on, you've cleaned the place, and now the patrons are starting to trickle in. The music starts, the ale flows, and the laughter gets louder. But for you, it's not just a festive atmosphere. It's a minefield. You learn pretty quickly that the line between a customer and a creep is a razor's edge, and that most of the time, that line doesn't even exist. The casual, almost unconscious grabbing and groping wasn't a risk you might take. It was part of the job description. Every time you served a drink, every time you bent down to pick something up, you were bracing yourself. You'd feel that familiar cold fear, a sudden chill, running up your spine before a hand would reach out. It might be a quick pinch on your arm, a lingering touch on your back, or a crude grab that made your stomach lurch. You'd have to master the art of the perfect practiced flinch, a movement so subtle that no one else would notice, but one that left you feeling violated and angry. And here's the kicker. You couldn't complain. Oh, you could try, but it would get you nowhere. If you slapped a patron, if you called them out, the punishment was yours, not theirs. The tavern owner would chew you out, maybe even dock your pay. The other customers would mock you, call you a prude or a troublemaker. The air would be thick with tension, and the cold reality was that their fun was more important than your comfort. It was a kind of perverse code of conduct. The cold fear of punishment was a much more potent deterrent than any complaint you could make. So you developed a new kind of muscle memory. Your hands, already busy pouring and wiping, became masters of the mid-pour dodge. A hand would reach out, and without spilling a single drop, you'd shift your weight, turn your body, or pull back just enough to avoid their touch. The sound of the ale splashing into the mug was a calming rhythm, the only sound you could trust. This wasn't an act of grace. It was pure survival. It was a quiet, constant fight that no one else ever saw. You got used to the feeling. It was a kind of dull, ever-present weight, a new kind of trauma disguised as just part of the tavern life. You'd serve a man who just moments before had made you feel disgusted, and you'd have to smile and pretend it never happened. You'd feel the warmth of the mug in your hand, a stark contrast to the coldness in your heart. You were a medieval barmaid who was also a human pincushion, and every pinprick was a reminder of your lack of power. The smell of their cheap liquor and sweaty clothes was a scent you'd come to associate with danger. The sticky feeling of the counter under your palms was a constant reminder of the grossness of the job. You'd feel a kind of emotional callousness growing inside you, a way to numb the pain and the humiliation. It was a coping mechanism, a way to build a wall around your heart and mind, so you could get through another night. And it wasn't just the hands, it was the words, the crude jokes, the comments whispered in your ear, the suggestions you'd have to just laugh off. It was a constant barrage of disrespect that ate away at you slowly and painfully. The noise of the tavern, the clinking of mugs, and the roaring laughter was a kind of auditory torture, a backdrop to the endless assault on your dignity. The worst part was knowing that if you had a sister, a daughter, or a friend who came to work at the tavern, you'd have to give them a brutal lesson in self-preservation. Don't look in the eye for too long, you'd whisper. Keep your hands busy. Don't stop moving. You'd be passing on a terrible, sad legacy. The weight of that knowledge was a heavy stone in your gut. You'd see the customers, their faces flushed with drink and pleasure, and you'd feel a kind of emptiness. They were having the time of their lives, and you were just a prop in their story. You were forced to participate in a script you never agreed to, a performance where your only role was to be a victim. You'd feel a dull ache in your bones, a tiredness that went deeper than just being on your feet all day. The silence that followed a late-night assault was always the loudest part. The patron would have left the crowd, would have moved on, and you'd be left alone with the echoes of their actions. The cold of the empty air around you felt like a judgment, a chilling feeling that the entire world had turned its back on you. You'd look at your hands, your tools, the only thing you had control over, and you'd wonder if they could ever be clean again. It's a strange thing, but you'd also develop a kind of empathy for the others, the other girls who worked there. You'd see their faces, the masks they wore, and you'd know their pain, even without a single word. You'd share a look, a small knowing glance that said, "I see you. I know what you're going through." It was a secret language of silent suffering, a small connection in a sea of loneliness. It was a quiet rebellion. And as you'd finish a long night, you'd feel the texture of the rough counter as you wiped it down one last time. You'd look at the empty chairs and imagine the ghosts of all the hands that had touched you, the hands that had taken your dignity. But you would survive. You always did. The next morning you'd wake up and put on that same uniform, a kind of sad armour, and you'd walk back into the battlefield, ready for the next round. You'd have to, right? Because the only other option was to give up. You know how in the movies, a bar brawl is this big epic thing that ends with a heroic knockout, and everyone cheering. Yeah, that's a load of crap. In reality, it was a sudden, terrifying explosion of violence that left you with a mess to deal with. One minute, you're serving a pint to a quiet patron, and the next, a chair is flying through the air, and two men are on the floor, their faces a mask of rage. You had to learn to keep your hands steady, and your wits about you, because the fighting was almost a nightly occurrence. The sound of it was what got you first. The sudden shriek of splintering wood, the sickening crunch of bone, and the roar of a crowd that was half terrified, half excited. The tension was so thick you could almost taste it, and a cold dread would settle in the pit of your stomach. And what were you supposed to do? You couldn't just run and hide. Your job was to keep serving. Even as a man bled from a gash on his head, you had to keep pouring, keep smiling, keep the illusion of normalcy alive. The medieval barmaid was a professional in the art of feigned indifference, and you were a witness to it all. The sword fights, the chair throwing, the table flips. It was a brutal spectacle. You'd see a man get knocked out, his head hitting the floor with a sickening thud, and you'd have to step over him to get to the ale barrel. The blood that began to pool on the floor felt like a kind of judgment, a crimson reminder of the violence you had no power to stop. The air, already thick with smoke and ale, would now have the metallic tang of blood, a smell that would haunt you long after the fight was over. The aftermath was your problem. The tables were overturned, mugs lay shattered, and broken teeth could be found mixed in with the straw on the floor. There were no guards, no authorities to call. It was just you. So you'd get out your mop and your bucket, and you'd start the grim task of cleaning. The cold of the mop water was a stark contrast to the heat of the conflict that just happened. You'd have to scrub the floors, feeling the sticky grime under your hands, trying to erase the evidence of the brutality that was just another part of the tavern life. There was a strange kind of logic to it. A broken mug meant less profit. A broken table meant more work. So you cleaned with a grim determination. You'd pick up a shard of glass, feeling the sharp edge against your calloused fingers, and you'd wonder whose life had just been irrevocably changed. The sound of your broom sweeping up the debris was the only sound in the sudden eerie silence that followed the fight. You had to mop and pray, hoping that the men would get up and that the fight wouldn't spill out into the street. The fear was always there, a constant companion. You'd never know when the next brawl would start, or if you'd be caught in the middle of it. The cold sweat would bead on your brow, and you'd feel a kind of electric tension in the air. The smell of fear was something you became intimately familiar with, a kind of musky scent that mixed with the alcohol and the smoke. You'd look at the other patrons, their faces alight with morbid curiosity, and you'd feel a kind of lonely disgust. They were there for the spectacle. You were just there to clean it up. And it was a good reminder that your life was cheap. You were expendable. If a flying mug hit you, or if you got in the way of a swinging sword, no one would mourn for you for long. The tavern owner would just find another girl. That knowledge was a heavy weight on your shoulders. It forced you to be constantly aware, constantly vigilant. The pain of your sore feet and aching back was nothing compared to the fear that lived in your gut, a knot of pure terror that never quite unraveled. You'd see the most horrific things, things that would give you nightmares. You'd see a man with a broken nose, blood dripping onto his tunic, and he'd just laugh it off, as if nothing had happened. You'd see the raw, visceral hatred in their eyes, and you'd wonder what could possibly drive a person to such a place. The barmaid was a front-row spectator to the darkest aspects of human nature, a kind of unwilling anthropologist of violence. The emotional toll was immense. You'd go to bed with the sounds of the brawl still ringing in your ears, the image of a bloodied face seared into your memory. The cold fear would linger, making it hard to sleep. You'd pull the blanket up to your chin, a small act of self-protection, and you'd feel the rough texture of the fabric against your cheek. Pain you felt wasn't just physical. It was a deep, emotional wound that never had time to heal. Sometimes after the last patron had stumbled out, and the place was finally quiet, you'd find a small forgotten item on the floor. Maybe a half-eaten piece of bread or a single coin. You'd pick it up and you'd imagine the person who lost it, the story behind it. The fleeting scent of a different kind of life, a life where you weren't constantly on the brink of chaos. It was a fleeting bittersweet moment of nostalgia. And then, as you'd finish the last bit of scrubbing, a strange calm would settle over you. Fear would subside, and in its place would be a weary kind of resignation. You were a survivor, a witness, and a cleaner of other people's sins. You'd look at your hands, still dirty from the work, and you'd feel a sense of pride in your own resilience. You'd made it through another night. As you turned the corner to head to your room, you'd hear a strange creaking sound. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe something else had come to visit. You'd feel a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, a prickling sensation on the back of your neck. You wouldn't think twice about it, just keep moving. After all, the real ghosts were the ones you had to clean up every single night. You know we take clean water for granted. Like, seriously. We can just turn on a tap and get something safe to drink. Back then, that was a luxury. So people drank ale, or watered down wine, because the brewing process killed a lot of the bad stuff that was in the water. But don't for a second think this meant the drink itself was safe. Oh no. The ale you served was a gamble. It was a liquid Russian roulette, and you were the one pulling the trigger for every single patron who walked through the door. The barrels themselves were a health hazard. They were probably old, mouldy and rarely cleaned. You'd have to stick your hands in there, feeling the slimy texture of the wood, the musty smell of age and decay, and you just have to hope for the best. And then there were the rats. Oh crap, the rats. They were everywhere. They'd gnaw on the barrels, fall into the vats, and leave their droppings wherever they pleased. You'd find them, these little dark pellets, in the bottom of a mug, a sickening find that you'd have to pretend not to see. And the taste, it was a mystery every time. Sometimes the ale was fine, just a little sour. Other times it was thick and bitter, almost chunky. It could be spoiled from the heat, or worse, someone could have put something in it. Poisoning was a real fear. It could be a rival tavern owner, a disgruntled patron, or just some random schmuck who thought it was funny. You had to taste it, just a little bit before you served it, a small and dangerous ritual that was a part of your job. The sharp, acrid taste of something wrong was a bitter memory you had to endure. You'd serve a pint to a man, and he'd take a big gulp, and you'd watch his face. Was he just surprised by the taste, or was something actually wrong? The medieval barmaid was also an amateur doctor, a silent observer of her customers' well-being, or lack thereof. The fear would settle in the pit of your stomach, a cold knot that grew tighter with every passing minute. You'd feel the clammy texture of the mugs as you handed them over, a stark contrast to the warmth of your own fear. And the worst part, if a customer died, you were blamed. It didn't matter if it was a heart attack, another fight, or actual poisoning. You were the last person who served them. You'd be dragged before the local lord, or a tribunal, accused of being a witch or a killer. They wouldn't care about the mouldy barrels, or the rat droppings. All they would care about was that the patron was now dead, and you were the one who served them their last drink. You could be flogged, or worse, hung. The cold fear of that possibility was a weight you carried with you every single day. There was no such thing as quality control. The only thing you could do was sniff it and guess. You'd put your nose to the foaming brew and take a deep whiff. The smell of something rotten, something off, was a sign to either dump it out or give it to the least discerning customer. It was a grim game of chance, and you were the dealer. The smell of the tainted ale was a disgusting perfume, you'd never forget a scent, that was a kind of a sad warning. You'd become a kind of alchemist, learning to mix the bad with the good, to hide the taste, to get rid of the evidence. You'd feel a kind of morbid pride in your ability to make a bad drink taste passable, a small act of defiance against the harsh realities of your life. It was a skill you never thought you'd have, a dark art you had to master to survive. The weight of that knowledge was heavy. Plenty circumstance would on I now, but you'd watch the customers drink, their faces growing flushed with the alcohol, their laughter getting louder, and you'd wonder if any of them knew the risks they were taking. You'd feel a strange kind of empathy for them, a shared sense of vulnerability in a world where nothing was truly safe. The heat of the fire in the hearth would feel good on your face, a welcome contrast to the cold fear that lived in your gut. And sometimes, in the middle of a busy night, a sudden thought would flash in your mind. What if something happened to you? What if the ale you tasted was also tainted? The fear was a physical presence, a chilling touch on your skin that made you shiver. But you couldn't stop. The job was your life, and the only way to live was to keep going, to keep pouring. You had to serve with a blank face, a kind of sad performance. You were a walking, talking, public health crisis. You had to serve drinks that were probably making people sick, knowing you couldn't do anything about it. The sounds of their coughing and wheezing were a kind of sad symphony, and the smell of their feverish sweat was a disgusting reminder of the danger you were in, the danger you were also serving. It was a bleak existence, and the only solace was the knowledge that you weren't alone. The worst feeling was when a patron would look you in the eye and say, "This is the best drink I've ever had," and you'd have to just smile and thank them. The shame and guilt would eat away at you, a slow, painful burn that left you hollow. You had to lie for a living, and it was a lie that could and did kill people. The lie had a texture, a kind of coarse feeling that scraped against your insides, and a bitter taste you could never wash away. As you'd clean up the final mugs, you'd see a forgotten half-full pint left on a table. The drink would be flat, and a single fly would be circling it. You'd look at it, and you'd see all the stories it could tell. Of the patron who drank it, of the barrel it came from, and of the danger it held. You'd pick up the mug feeling the cold weight of it in your hand, and you'd have to get rid of it. But the memory, the guilt, the fear, that would stay with you. You'd feel the cold air from the window on your back, a chilling reminder that no one, not even you, was safe from the poisons in the world. Listen, the whole idea of a tip jar is a modern invention. In the medieval era, that didn't exist. You weren't working for a steady wage, not really. You were paid in crumbs, a tiny fraction of what the tavern owner made. So you were always just barely getting by. The hunger gnawing at your stomach was a constant companion, and the cold of a night spent shivering was a familiar feeling. Your pay, if you even got it, was just enough to keep you alive, and nothing more. This was a truth you had to swallow with every stale piece of bread. So, how did you survive? You relied on the kindness of patrons, which, let's be honest, was a rare and terrifying thing. A patron might throw you a copper coin, and it would feel like a fortune. But often, those coins came with a price tag, a kind of unwritten, unspoken request for favours. The words hung in the air, a silent proposition that you had to understand without a single word being said. You'd feel the cold, metallic weight of the coin in your hand, and you'd know that it wasn't just money. It was a bribe. The pressure was immense. You'd see another barmaid accepting a favour, and you'd feel a mix of pity and fear. You knew why she was doing it, to put food in her belly, to buy a warmer blanket, to just get by. But you also knew the cost. The loss of dignity, the shame that would settle over you like a shroud. Refusing a patron was a dangerous game. It could mean losing your job on the spot, or worse, becoming a target for their anger and humiliation. The fear of that was a powerful deterrent. Survival for a medieval barmaid often came with a side of shame. It was a brutal reality. You find yourself making choices you never thought you'd make. You'd smile at a man who repulsed you. You'd let his hand linger on your arm for a moment too long. You'd force a laugh at a dirty joke. Each small act was a tiny piece of your soul being chipped away, a slow and painful erosion of who you were. The feeling of that shame was a cold knot in your gut, a physical manifestation of your moral compromise. You were a performer in a grim play, and your only role was to be a pawn. The patrons held all the power, and you had to play along. The texture of the rough tunic on your skin felt like a constant reminder of your station, of your vulnerability. You'd hear the clinking of coins from a nearby table, and you'd feel a kind of desperate envy. If only I could just get by on my hard work. But you knew that wasn't how the world worked. There were moments of genuine kindness, and they were like a balm for your weary soul. A traveller might see your exhaustion and give you an extra coin for no reason at all. An old woman might slip you a piece of bread. She baked herself. These were small acts of grace in a world of cruelty, and you'd hold on to them, to the warmth of that small gesture, as if they were a lifeline. They reminded you that not everyone was terrible, that some people still had a soul. Those moments were rare. More often, it was just the opposite. Each knight might demand royal treatment, and you'd have to serve him with grace and a smile, even though he'd pay you nothing and would probably make a rude comment. The humiliation was a kind of physical pain, a throbbing ache in your chest that no amount of ale could numb. You were a barmaid, and you were not a person, not to them. You would find yourself dreaming of a different life, a life where you didn't have to sell pieces of yourself to survive. You'd imagine a small house with a garden, where you could grow your own food, where you could close the door and feel safe. The scent of a clean kitchen, a warm fire, a life without fear. It was a fantasy, a beautiful lie you told yourself to get through the night. The longing for it was a sharp pain, a cold slice through your heart. And you'd see the other girls, the ones who had been there longer than you. Their eyes were empty, their faces were hard. They had already made their choices, and the shame was a permanent part of their existence. You wonder if that would be you someday, a ghost in your own life, a woman with a broken spirit who just kept going. The thought was a chilling prospect, a kind of preemptive grief for the person you were losing. Tavern owner was no help. They were often a worse kind of villain. They'd turn a blind eye to the harassment, or they would even encourage it. They'd take most of your meagre pay, and they'd make you feel like you were lucky to have the job at all. The rough texture of their words was a kind of verbal abuse that left you feeling worthless. The reality was, quitting wasn't an option. The world outside the tavern was just as cold, and you had no other place to go. So you survived. You learned to read people to know who was a threat and who wasn't. You learned to put on a mask, to become a different person entirely. The barmaid you presented to the world was strong and unyielding, but the girl underneath was scared and alone. You'd go to bed with the taste of shame on your tongue, a bitter flavour that never went away. You'd feel the cold draft from the window, and you'd just wrap yourself up and wish for the morning to come. As the last lamp would flicker out, a sudden silence would fall over the tavern, but it was a silence filled with the ghosts of the night. You'd think about a time when a smile was just a smile, and a touch was just a touch. You'd feel the ache in your tired feet, and you'd know that the price of survival was steeper than any coin in the world. You'd wonder what life would be like if you didn't have to carry the weight of so many secrets. You'd have to keep those thoughts to yourself, though, because in this life, your only friend was the quiet darkness. Alright, let's talk about the unsavory reality of sanitation, or more accurately, the complete lack of it. When you think of a medieval tavern, you probably imagine a cozy, bustling place. You don't think about the stench, but that smell was a fundamental part of your life. It was a thick, humid, and overwhelming presence that clung to every single surface. You couldn't escape it. You didn't just serve ale. You were a full-time waste manager, and the job was just as disgusting as it sounds. The latrine was a simple trench out back. No flushing, no privacy, just a long pit. And guess who got to clean it? You'd have to get out there with a bucket and a shovel, and with bare hands. Crap, you had no gloves. You'd scoop out the waste. The smell of the raw sewage was so potent, it could make your eyes water and your stomach churn. The flies, fat and buzzing, were a constant disgusting swarm. You'd have to swat them away, but it was a losing battle. The texture of the damp, putrid earth under your boots was a sensory nightmare. And it wasn't just the outdoor trench. The chamber pots. Oh, the chamber pots. At night, people would do their business in a pot right in their rooms. The next morning, you had to collect them and dump them out. And where did you dump them? Right into the alley out back. The sound of the sloshing, the sickening splat, was a daily symphony. The smell would be so foul, a kind of concentrated terror, that you would have to hold your breath as you did it. Your stomach would clench with a deep, visceral disgust. The filth was everywhere. It was a part of the air you breathed, the ground you walked on. The medieval barmaid couldn't escape it. Your hands were constantly dirty, no matter how much you tried to wash them in the cold water from the well. Your clothes, your hair, even your skin would feel greasy and grimy. The taste of dust and filth was a permanent presence in your mouth. You would look at your reflection in the water bucket and barely recognize the person staring back at you. You'd walk through the tavern, serving drinks, and you'd have this secret knowledge, this disgusting truth. The mug in your hand was clean, but the alley you just came from was a cesspool. The smiling patrons had no idea what you had just done. It was a kind of hidden shame, a silent burden that you carried with you. You'd feel a kind of cold detachment, a way to separate yourself from the work you were forced to do. This kind of work made you smell. The stench of human waste, of stale ale, of sweat and filth was a permanent perfume. You'd get used to it, of course, but you'd also notice how others reacted. People would subtly step back or turn their head, and you would know why. The smell wasn't just a byproduct of the job. It was a badge of honor, in a twisted kind of way. It meant you were working hard. It meant you were a true barmaid. But this wasn't just a matter of discomfort. It was a matter of life and death. Filth and the flies were breeding grounds for infections and diseases. A small cut on your hand could turn into something much worse. A plague could sweep through the town, and you, working in the very heart of the filth, would be one of the first to get it. The cold fear of that was a constant nagging presence, a low hum of anxiety that never went away. You'd see the customers, happy and oblivious, and you'd feel a kind of resentful pity. They had no idea of the reality of your life, the grim work you did behind the scenes. They saw a pretty face, a hand that served ale. They didn't see the stains on your tunic, the grime under your nails, the raw, aching feeling of your skin. It was a secret world, a brutal and filthy one, and you were its only inhabitant. The tavern life was a far cry from what the bards sang about. It was a life of unending work, and the most menial, disgusting tasks often fell to you. You'd feel a kind of bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. The smell of the alley would follow you into your dreams, a kind of terrifying memory that you couldn't escape. It was a kind of a sad and lonely existence, and the only solace was the knowledge that you were a survivor. You would look at your hands, rough and chapped, and you'd feel a kind of morbid pride in them. They were a testament to your hard work, to the life you were forced to live. They were also a constant source of pain, a reminder of the raw physical reality of your life. The cold of the bucket you carried, the rough texture of the shovel handle, the slimy feel of the waste. It was all part of you now, and sometimes in the dead of the night, you'd be woken up by a sudden sound. Maybe a rat scurrying across the floor, or the unsettling creak of the floorboards. You'd lie there in the dark, and you'd hear the sounds of the tavern settling down. You'd think about all the filth, all the sickness, all the things you had to do. The loneliness would be a palpable thing, a weight on your chest that made it hard to breathe. As you'd drift back to sleep, a final thought would cross your mind. The tavern owner would be sleeping soundly, and so would all the patrons. They were clean, they were safe, but you were still out there in some small way in that alley, with the flies and the stench. You were still carrying the burden of their filth. The weight of that knowledge was a heavy price to pay, and it was a price you paid every single day. The sun would soon rise, and the cycle would begin again, bringing with it a whole new set of smells and tasks. You know, the idea of a bard is so romantic, right? Traveling musician with a lute weaving tales of heroes and dragons. Well, let me tell you, the reality was way, way different. The bard at your tavern was usually a shambling, pathetic figure, more drunk than sober, who probably hadn't bathed in a month. He was a permanent fixture, an annoying soundtrack to your already miserable life. He wouldn't just shut up, he was a living, breathing nuisance who was the source of a constant headache. He had a repertoire of about 3 songs, and he'd play them, over and over again, night after night. You'd hear the same off-key chords, the same slurred lyrics, the same sad, familiar rhythm. It would start to get into your head, a kind of mental torture that you couldn't escape. The sound of his broken lute strings and his off-key singing was a kind of white noise that you had to learn to tune out, but it was always there, a low hum of annoyance that never went away. And he wasn't just bad at singing, he was a mess. He'd occasionally start crying mid-verse, his face a pathetic mask of boozy sadness. He'd forget the words, or he'd just start talking to himself. The patrons would either mock him or feel a grim kind of pity, but you just had to keep serving your face, a blank canvas. The sight of his tear-stained face and the smell of his sour breath were a disgusting, heartbreaking reality that you had to endure. And here's the kicker. You were expected to smile and clap anyway. You'd have to force a smile, a kind of fake, theatrical gesture, and clap your hands together. It was a humiliating performance, an act of forced politeness that went against every fibre of your being. You'd look at the other barmaids, and they'd have the same pained expression, the same forced smile. It was a kind of unspoken, shared misery. The sound of your hands clapping was a hollow, empty noise. But the worst part, oh crap, the worst part was when he puked. It was an inevitable part of the night. He'd be mid-song, and then with a lurch, he'd lean over and throw up all over the floor. Sometimes he'd get it on your feet. You'd feel the warm, disgusting liquid seep into the fabric of your shoes, and you'd have to just stand there, a kind of cold, resigned shock on your face. You couldn't just walk away. You had to clean it up. The texture of the vomit, the smell, the utter disgust. It was all just a part of the job. Drunken Bard was a walking, talking embodiment of all the sadness and ugliness of the tavern life. He was a reminder that people came to this place to drown their sorrows, and that sometimes the sorrow would just bubble up and spill out all over the place. You'd feel a kind of resentful empathy for him, this pathetic creature who was trapped in a cycle of alcoholism and bad music. You were both prisoners in a way, trapped in the same grim reality. He was a source of constant tension. You'd never know when he would start a fight, or when he would just collapse and pass out. The other patrons would get rowdy, egging him on, and the noise would get louder and more chaotic. The fear of a brawl was always present, a kind of electric tension that made your skin prickle. You'd feel a kind of bone-deep exhaustion, a weariness that went beyond just being on your feet all day. You'd think about a time when music was beautiful. You'd remember a song your mother used to sing, a simple lullaby that was so full of love and warmth. The contrast was a painful one. The memory was a sweet scent, a fleeting moment of nostalgia that was quickly overpowered by the smell of vomit and stale ale. The medieval barmaid was forced to live in a world where beauty was a forgotten thing. Drunken Bard was also a kind of a sad confidant. When he wasn't singing, he would often mumble to you, telling you sad stories about a life he once had, a family he lost, a love he left behind. The words would come out in a slurred torrent, and you'd just have to stand there and listen. The weight of his sorrows was a heavy burden, a kind of emotional baggage you had to carry with you. You'd look at him, slumped over in his chair, and you'd feel a kind of strange kinship. He was a performer, and so were you. He sang songs to entertain, and you put on a smile to survive. You both pretended to be something you weren't. You were a barmaid who acted like a happy servant. He was a musician who acted like he was happy. The sound of his deep, rasping breaths was the only thing that filled the air. And sometimes, in the middle of a busy night, a sudden thought would flash in your mind. What if he was a ghost? What if he was a living echo of a life he once had, a sad memory that was forced to repeat itself? The thought was a chilling prospect, a kind of morbid curiosity that you couldn't shake. The cold dread would settle in your stomach, and you'd shiver even though the tavern was warm. As you'd clean up the last of the debris, you'd look at the empty stage where he used to sit. The space would feel strangely hollow. You'd feel the cold of the mop handle in your hands, and you'd wonder if you too were a kind of ghost. A ghost of a person you once were, a person you were slowly forgetting. The silence that followed his departure was a kind of relief, but it was also a kind of loneliness. The tavern was quiet, but the sad music still played in your head. Listen, when you hear the word plague, your mind probably goes to images of death, isolation and quarantine. But for a medieval barmaid, the reality was far more terrifying and frankly more mundane. When a disease, be it the Black Death or just a common fever, swept through the village, you couldn't just close up shop and go hide. People still got thirsty. People still needed a place to forget their sorrows. So you had to keep working even as death walked right up to your counter and ordered a drink. You'd be serving a patron, and he'd be coughing and sneezing right in your face. He'd drop a coin, and you'd have to pick it up, feeling the warm metal against your skin, knowing that it was probably covered in sickness. You'd have to refill his mug, feeling the clammy texture of the ceramic, and you'd be looking at his eyes, looking for any sign of the sickness. You saw fear. The fear of getting sick was a kind of cold, constant dread, a low thrum of anxiety that never went away. The sight of a customer dropping dead mid-drink wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a terrifying reality. One minute, they'd be laughing, a kind of forced, brittle laughter, and the next, they'd slump over, their bodies suddenly lifeless. You'd have to walk over to them feeling a kind of hollow emptiness in your gut, and you'd have to take their money. You'd have to get their mug, feeling the cold weight of the vessel, and you'd have to wash it, hoping the hot water would kill whatever was on it. The smell of their sickly sweat was a kind of macabre perfume. And what did the medieval barmaid do for protection? Nothing. There was no such thing as quarantine. There were no doctors, no cures. People would get sick and they'd die, and life would just go on. Some people would wear garlic necklaces, a ridiculous pungent superstition that did nothing to protect them. The smell of the raw garlic, a sharp bitter scent, was a kind of sad humour in a grim situation. You'd see a big, burly soldier with a necklace of garlic around his neck, and you'd want to laugh, but you knew better. The constant paranoia was a kind of madness. Every cough, every sneeze, every touch was a potential death sentence. You'd feel a prickling sensation on your skin, a phantom itch, and you'd wonder if you were getting sick. You'd feel a sudden cold sweat, and you'd have to pretend it was just the heat from the hearth. You were a walking, talking disease vector, a person who was constantly on the brink of death. And the only thing you could do was keep pouring. The silence that followed, a death was always the loudest part. The other patrons would go quiet, a kind of reverent hush that was more about fear than respect. They'd look at you, their eyes full of a kind of pity and fear, as if you were already a dead woman walking. You'd feel a kind of lonely isolation, a sense of being on an island of your own. The only solace was the knowledge that you weren't the only one, that the other barmaids were going through the same thing. The tavern wasn't just a place for drinks, it was also a place for rumours. They say the sickness came from the well. One person would whisper, "I heard a witch cursed the village." Another would say, "The whispers were a kind of cruel game, a desperate attempt to find a scapegoat for their own terror. The sound of their voices, low and conspiratorial, was a kind of background noise to the sounds of coughing and moaning. You'd have to work through it all, and the work was a kind of mindless drone. You'd be on autopilot, your body moving, your hands working, but your mind would be somewhere else entirely. You'd find yourself thinking about a time when you didn't have to worry about death, a time when a cough was just a cough. The memory was a sweet, distant thing, a fleeting moment of peace that was a sharp contrast to the grim reality of your life. And the loneliness, it was a profound and crushing thing. You were surrounded by people, but you couldn't get close to any of them. You'd have to keep your distance, to keep your hands to yourself. The smell of fear was a kind of perfume, a low musky scent that mixed with the alcohol and the smoke. You'd feel a kind of cold detachment, a way to protect yourself from the emotional and physical reality of the situation. The sight of the bodies being carried out of the tavern was something you never got used to. The look on their faces, the strange empty expression, it was something that haunted your dreams. You'd pull the blanket up to your chin, and you'd still see them, their pale faces and their lifeless eyes. The chilling dread of that was a kind of phantom pain, a wound that never had a chance to heal. You'd look at the other barmaids, and you'd see the same fear in their eyes. The unspoken understanding between you was a kind of bond, a shared sense of doom. You'd just give them a nod, a small gesture of solidarity, and you'd get back to work. There was no time for fear, no time for self-pity. You had to keep going. As the final patron would stumble out, and the place would be quiet again, you'd find yourself standing still for a moment. The air would be heavy with the scent of sickness, and the cold of the night would seep into your bones. You'd feel the weight of all the lives you had seen slip away, the ghosts that now inhabited the tavern. You'd have to get the mop and the bucket and clean up the filth, the sickness and the death. It was a kind of solemn ritual, a final act of respect for the dead. The sound of your broom sweeping up the dirt, and the disease was a quiet, lonely sound, and you'd have to do it all over again tomorrow. You know the regulars. Every tavern has them. They're the guys who think they own the place just because they show up every night. And they were, without a doubt, the worst part of your job. They weren't just patrons. They were an entitlement. They'd sit at the same table, tell the same dirty jokes, and their hands were always a little too close to you. They were a kind of low-grade constant threat, and you had to deal with them every single night. The sight of their familiar faces was a kind of chilling dread that never went away. They had their own rules, and you were expected to follow them. They'd get angry if their seat was taken, even if they hadn't arrived yet. Tension would be palpable, a kind of low growl that you could feel in the air. You'd have to go over, feeling the cold knot of fear in your stomach, and try to diffuse the situation. The texture of their rough voices, their slurred threats was a kind of auditory assault that you had to endure. You'd have to play the role of a mediator, a kind of sad diplomat, just to keep the peace. They expected their mug of ale to be ready and waiting for them before they even asked. It was a kind of silent demand, a pressure that you had to always be on top of. You'd be busy with a dozen other things, and you'd see them walk in, and you'd feel a sudden rush of adrenaline. You'd have to drop everything and go get their drink, a kind of small, humiliating act of submission. The cold of the mug in your hand was a constant reminder of your lack of power. Their dirty jokes and handsy habits were a constant presence. They'd make a crude comment, and you'd just have to smile and nod. A hand would linger on your arm for a moment too long, and you'd have to just pretend not to notice. The shame of it was a kind of physical pain, a slow and painful erosion of your dignity. The medieval barmaid was a professional at ignoring disrespect, and this was where she got most of her practice. It was a kind of tragic performance, and the only audience was you. And God forbid you spilled a drink. The slightest mistake could start a riot. A single splash of ale on the floor, a single drop on their clothes, and they'd explode. The sound of their yelling, their angry beer-fueled rage, was a kind of terrifying symphony. The other patrons would go silent, and the whole tavern would become a tense, dangerous place. You'd have to apologize profusely, even though it was an accident. The cold fear of their anger was a kind of phantom chill that made you shiver. The regulars were a kind of sad testament to the human condition. They were lonely, pathetic men who came to the tavern to feel a sense of power they lacked in their own lives. They would tell you their stories, their secrets, and their failure. The weight of their sorrows was a kind of emotional baggage you had to carry with you. You were a barmaid, but you were also a therapist and a human punching bag. You'd think about a time when you didn't have to deal with them. A time when a night at a tavern was just about having fun. The memory of that was a sweet, distant thing, a fleeting moment of peace that was a sharp contrast to the grim reality of your life. The scent of their stale tobacco and their sweaty clothes was a kind of perfume, a low, musky smell that never went away. The one good thing about them was that they were predictable. You knew what they wanted, you knew how they would act. You could prepare for them. The medieval barmaid was a master strategist, a person who had to plan her every move, her every word, just to get through the night. The pressure of it was immense, a kind of constant low-grade anxiety that never went away. You would look at them, their faces flushed with drink and pleasure, and you'd feel a kind of resentful pity. They had no idea of the reality of your life, the grim work you did behind the scenes. They saw a happy barmaid, a hand that served ale. They didn't see the stains on your tunic, the grime under your nails, the raw aching feeling of your skin. It was a secret world, a brutal and filthy one, and you were its only inhabitant. And sometimes in the dead of the night, you'd be woken up by a sudden sound. Maybe a rat scurrying across the floor, or the unsettling creak of the floorboards. You'd lie there in the dark, and you'd think about the regulars. You'd feel a cold, lonely ache in your heart. You were so alone, surrounded by so many people, and yet you felt like the only person in the world. As you'd finish cleaning the last of the mugs, you'd look at the table where the regulars usually sat. The space would feel strangely hollow. You'd feel the cold of the mop handle in your hands, and you'd wonder if you too were a kind of ghost. A ghost of a person you once were, a person you were slowly forgetting. The silence that followed their departure was a kind of relief, but it was also a kind of loneliness. The tavern was quiet, but the sad music of their voices still played in your head. You know that feeling when you've worked a long, hard week and you're so ready for the weekend. That sweet, sweet relief of a day off. Well, forget it. The medieval barmaid didn't have that. There was no such thing as a day off. You worked 7 days a week, from before sunrise to long after the last patron had stumbled out. It was a relentless grinding cycle of labour, and the only rest you got was when you were too exhausted to move. Holidays were no relief. They were a curse. While everyone else was celebrating at church feasts or village festivals, you were working twice as hard. More people meant more drunks, which meant more fights and more clean-up. You'd hear the sounds of music and laughter drifting in from the street, and you'd feel a kind of resentful emptiness. The smell of roasted meats and sweet pies was a kind of cruel torture, a reminder of the feast you couldn't join. You had to keep serving your face a blank canvas of forced cheerfulness, while your heart ached with loneliness. And being sick? Forget it. You couldn't just call out. If you had a fever, if your body ached, you still had to work. Tavern owner didn't care. They'd just look at you with a cold, hard stare and say, "Get back to work." You'd feel the clammy texture of your skin, the hot flush of the fever, and you'd have to just keep going. You'd move with a kind of a sad, sluggish slowness, your body a rebellion against your own will. The cold fear of collapsing in the middle of a busy night was a constant weight on your shoulders. You'd push through the pain, the exhaustion, and the sickness. The medieval barmaid was a master of endurance. You learned to ignore the signals your body was sending you, to push past your own limits. The constant physical demands of the job, the heavy buckets of water, the scrubbing of the floors, the lifting of the barrels, took a toll on you. Your hands would be raw, your back would ache, and your feet would be a constant source of throbbing pain. The thought of rest was a kind of sweet dream, a beautiful lie you told yourself to get through the night. You'd imagine a day where you could just lie in bed, where you could close your eyes and not worry about the next day's work. The memory of a soft bed, a warm blanket, a quiet moment of peace. It was a fantasy, a whisper of a life you could never have. The longing for it was a sharp, poignant pain. The relentless cycle of work left no room for anything else. There was no time for friends, no time for hobbies, no time for yourself. Your life was the tavern, and the tavern was your life. The smell of stale ale and smoke was a permanent perfume, and the sound of drunken laughter was a constant soundtrack. The cold of the night, the heat of the fire, the ache in your bones, it was all a part of you now. You'd look at the other barmaids, their faces etched with the same weary exhaustion, and you'd feel a kind of silent solidarity. You were all in it together, trapped in the same grim reality. You'd share a knowing glance, a small gesture of understanding, and you'd get back to work. There was no time for self-pity, no time for complaints. You were a machine, a cog in the wheel of the tavern. You had to keep moving, keep working, keep serving. The fear of being replaced was a powerful motivator. If you slowed down, if you showed weakness, the owner would just find another girl, and you'd be out in the street. The cold fear of that was a powerful deterrent. The medieval barmaid was a kind of anti-hero. She wasn't fighting dragons or saving kingdoms. She was fighting a much harder battle. The battle against exhaustion, the battle against despair, the battle against a world that didn't care about her. Her victories were small, her wounds were invisible, and her story was often untold. You would find yourself talking to the empty air, to the silent mugs and tables, a kind of sad confessional. You'd tell them about your pain, your loneliness, your dreams. The sound of your voice, low and quiet, was the only thing that filled the air. It was a kind of strange comfort, a way to feel a little less alone. And sometimes in the dead of the night, you'd be woken up by a sudden thought. What if you just stopped? What if you just didn't get up in the morning? The thought was a chilling prospect, a kind of dark temptation. You'd lie there in the dark, and you'd feel the cold dread of that possibility. As you drift back to sleep, a final thought would cross your mind. Rest was for the rich. It was a luxury you couldn't afford. You were a barmaid, and you had a job to do. You'd have to get up, you'd have to work, and you'd have to keep going. The weight of that knowledge was a heavy price to pay, and it was a price you paid every single day. The sun would soon rise, and the cycle would begin again, bringing with it a whole new set of tasks and challenges. You know how people come to a bar to vent, to talk about their problems, to get things off their chest? Well, In the medieval tavern, that was your job. You were a barmaid, but you were also a kind of therapist, a silent confidant who had to listen to the worst confessions and the ugliest secrets. You were a vessel for their emotional baggage, a human garbage disposal for their pain, and you had no one to talk to about your own. A patron would sit down, his face etched with sorrow, and he'd start to tell you about his life. He'd tell you about his wife who left him, his crops that failed, his son who died in a senseless battle. You had to nod, you had to smile, and you had to keep pouring the ale. The weight of his confession would sit on your shoulders, a heavy, invisible burden. The sound of his voice, low and full of pain, was a kind of sad music that you had to endure. You learned pretty quickly that reacting the wrong way could start a brawl. If you showed too much pity, they might feel like you were mocking them. If you were too cold, they might get angry. You had to master the art of the neutral expression, the compassionate nod, the silent, attentive listening. The medieval barmaid was a master of emotional camouflage, a person who had to hide her own feelings to protect herself and the others. Things you heard were often deeply disturbing. A man would confess to a crime he committed. A woman would whisper about a secret love affair. You'd hear stories of betrayal, of violence, of despair. The smell of their stale breath and their raw emotions was a kind of perfume, a low, musky scent that never went away. You had to absorb it all, and you had no way to let it out. You carried their trauma and your own. The tavern was a vortex of human pain, a place where people came to forget their sorrows, and you were a silent witness to it all. The emotional toll was immense. You'd go to bed at night with the sound of their voices still ringing in your ears, the image of their faces seared into your memory. The cold fear of it all was a kind of phantom chill that made you shiver even in your sleep. The patrons saw you as a blank slate, a person who had no life of her own. They didn't see your pain, your loneliness, your fears. They just saw a pretty face and a pair of hands that served ale. They were so wrapped up in their own problems that they didn't even consider that you might have a story of your own. It was a kind of sad irony. You were surrounded by people, but you were fundamentally alone. The only time you could really let your guard down was in the quiet hours after the last patron had left. You'd stand there in the silence, and you'd let all the emotions you had bottled up finally come out. You'd feel a kind of crushing sadness, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that went beyond just being on your feet all day. It was a kind of catharsis, a painful release that you had to have just to get through the next day. You'd think about a time when you could just talk, a time when a conversation was just a conversation. The memory of that was a sweet, distant thing, a fleeting moment of peace that was a sharp contrast to the grim reality of your life. The texture of the rough counter under your hands felt like a constant reminder of your station, of your vulnerability. You were a barmaid, and you were not a person, not to them. The knowledge you had was a kind of secret power, a kind of dark wisdom. You knew the secrets of the village, the hidden desires, the ugly truths. You knew who was in love with whom, who was a thief, who was a coward. It was a kind of a sad and lonely authority. You knew all their stories, but they knew nothing about yours. And the loneliness, it was a profound and crushing thing. You were surrounded by people, but you couldn't get close to any of them. You were an observer, a listener, a receptacle for their pain. The only person you could talk to was yourself, and you'd find yourself doing it, whispering to the empty air, to the silent mugs and tables, a kind of sad confessional. You'd look at the other barmaids, their faces etched with the same weary exhaustion, and you'd feel a kind of silent solidarity. You were all in it together, trapped in the same grim reality. You'd share a knowing glance, a small gesture of understanding, and you'd get back to work. There was no time for self-pity, No time for complaints. As you'd clean up the last of the debris, you'd feel a kind of emptiness, a hollow ache in your soul. The tavern was quiet, but the sad music of their voices still played in your head. The smell of stale ale and human sorrow was a permanent perfume. You'd look at your hands, rough and chapped, and you'd wonder if they could ever be clean again. You'd feel the cold of the night, and you'd have to keep going. The weight of that knowledge was a heavy price to pay, and it was a price you paid every single day. You know, in our world, when a woman is expecting, there's this kind of reverence, a sense of care and protection. In the medieval era, for a barmaid, that was a luxury you couldn't afford. There was no such thing as maternity leave. You were just a body, and as long as that body could serve ale, you had a job. So you'd work on swollen feet, your belly a growing testament to a life you were trying to bring into a world that couldn't care less. Your body was no longer your own. The fatigue, the morning sickness, the constant aches and pains. You had to push through all of it. The weight of the baby, the strain on your back, the swollen ankles. It was a kind of pain you had to just ignore. You'd be moving slowly, clumsily, trying to dodge a drunken patron or a swinging fist, your belly a vulnerable target. The cold fear of a misstep of a blow was a constant living thing in the pit of your stomach. You had to keep working, even when you felt like you were going to collapse. The tavern owner didn't care about your condition. He only cared about the profit. He'd look at your belly, his eyes cold and calculating, and he'd wonder if you could still do your job. The texture of his words, the lack of empathy, was a kind of verbal abuse that left you feeling worthless and alone. The cold reality was that quitting wasn't an option. The other barmaids would look at you, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. They knew your story, they knew what you were going through, and they also knew that your fate could be theirs. The silent solidarity between you was a kind of sad bond, a shared sense of doom. The smell of their fear and their worry was a kind of perfume, a low musky scent that never went away. And the worst part, some barmaids gave birth in the storage rooms in the dead of the night with only a few other girls to help. The pain, the fear, the exhaustion. It was a kind of terrifying, raw experience that no woman should ever have to go through. The smell of blood and sweat and fear was a kind of macabre perfume, a kind of ghost that would haunt the storage room long after the baby was born. The baby was a kind of a secret, a little life you had to hide from the world. Babies were raised behind the bar, in a small, cramped space, where they could hear the drunken laughter, the sounds of fights, the screams of the patrons. The sound of their crying would be a kind of quiet protest, a reminder that they were not meant for this life. You'd have to rock them, to sing to them, to tell them a different story, a story of a world that was better, a world that was safer. You were a mother, but you were also a barmaid. You had to juggle two impossible jobs, and you had to do it all with a smile on your face. You'd be holding your baby in one hand, and you'd be pouring a pint of ale with the other. The weight of both was immense, a kind of physical and emotional burden that you had to carry with you every single day. You'd feel a fierce protective love for your baby, a kind of warm, gentle feeling that was a sharp contrast to the cold, hard reality of your life. Texture of their soft skin, the sweet smell of their head, the sound of their tiny breaths. It was a kind of a sad and beautiful thing. They were your only reason to keep going, your only reason to fight. But the fear was always there, a constant companion. What if a drunk fell on them? What if a stray object hit them? The world of the tavern was a dangerous place, and you were forced to raise your child in it. You'd feel a kind of cold dread, a kind of knot in your stomach that made it hard to breathe. You'd find yourself dreaming of a different life, A life where you could raise your child in a safe place, where you didn't have to worry about them getting hurt. You'd imagine a small cottage with a garden, where you could grow your own food, where you could close the door and feel safe. The scent of a clean kitchen, a warm fire, a life without fear. It was a fantasy, a beautiful lie you told yourself to get through the night. The longing for it was a sharp pain, and the loneliness. It was a profound and crushing thing. You were a mother, but you were also a barmaid. You were so alone, surrounded by so many people, and yet you felt like the only person in the world. The only solace was the love you had for your child, a love that was a kind of light in the overwhelming darkness. As you'd finished cleaning the last of the mugs, you'd look at the small cramped space behind the bar where your baby was sleeping. You'd feel the cold of the night, and you'd have to keep going. The weight of that knowledge was a heavy price to pay, and it was a price you paid every single day. The sun would soon rise, and the cycle would begin again, but this time you had a new reason to fight. You know how you think of the tavern owner as the big friendly boss who looks out for you. That's a movie fantasy. The reality was that your biggest enemy wasn't some drunk patron, but the very person who was supposed to be your protector. The owner was a kind of a sad villain, a person who took advantage of your desperation and your lack of power. He was often a worse kind of monster than the men who came to drink. He'd take most of your pay, leaving you with just enough to scrape by. The medieval barmaid was a kind of an indentured servant, a person who was working for a pittance and had no way to complain. He'd blame you for every broken cup, every spilled drink, and every angry customer, as if it was your fault that a drunk fell down. The texture of his words, his cold, hard stare, was a kind of verbal abuse that left you feeling worthless and small. And sometimes he'd demand favours as part of the job. It's a kind of unwritten, unspoken request, a silent proposition that you had to understand without a single word being said. You'd feel the cold fear in your gut, a kind of knot that made it hard to breathe. The cold reality was that refusing him could mean losing your job, or worse. The shame of it was a kind of physical pain, a slow and painful erosion of your dignity. The tavern owner was a master manipulator, a person who knew how to use your fear against you. He'd make you feel like you were lucky to have the job at all, that he was doing you a favour. He'd tell you about all the other girls who would love to have your spot, a kind of veiled threat that kept you in line. The weight of his words was a heavy burden, a kind of emotional baggage you had to carry with you every single day. You'd find yourself dreaming of a different life. A life where you were your own boss, where you didn't have to answer to anyone. You'd imagine a small house with a garden, where you could grow your own food, where you could close the door and feel safe. The scent of a clean kitchen, a warm fire, a life without fear. It was a fantasy, a beautiful lie you told yourself to get through the night. The longing for it was a sharp, poignant pain. Tavern owner was a kind of king, and the tavern was his kingdom. He ruled with an iron fist, and you were just a pawn in his game. He didn't care about your well-being, your health, or your safety. He only cared about the profit. The sound of his laughter, his loud, booming voice, was a kind of torture, a reminder of his power and your lack of it. But the worst part was the loneliness. You were so alone, surrounded by so many people, and yet you felt like the only person in the world. The only solace was the silent solidarity between you and the other barmaids, a kind of unwritten understanding that you were all in it together. You'd share a knowing glance, a small gesture of understanding, and you'd get back to work. You had to become an expert at deflection, at hiding your true feelings. You'd have to smile and nod, even when you wanted to scream. You had to master the art of the blank face, the vacant smile, a mask that hid the churning emotions underneath. The medieval barmaid was a kind of actress, a person who had to perform a role to survive. The feeling of being trapped was a constant living thing. You couldn't quit. The world outside the tavern was just as cold and just as dangerous, and you had no other place to go. The cold fear of being out in the street was a powerful deterrent. So you stayed, you worked, and you endured. The weight of that knowledge was a heavy price to pay. You would find yourself talking to the empty air, to the silent mugs and tables, a kind of sad confessional. You'd tell them about your pain, your loneliness, your fears. The sound of your voice, low and quiet, was the only thing that filled the air. It was a kind of strange comfort, a way to feel a little less alone. And the taste of shame. It was a bitter flavour that never went away. It was a part of every meal you ate, every drink you served, every smile you faked. The shame of being a pawn in someone else's game, of having no control over your own life, was a kind of physical pain, a slow and painful burn that left you hollow. You'd look at your hands, rough and chapped, and you'd feel a kind of morbid pride in them. They were a testament to your hard work, to the life you were forced to live. They were also a constant source of pain, a reminder of the raw physical reality of your life, the cold of the bucket you carried, the rough texture of the counter. It was all a part of you now. As you'd clean up the last of the debris, you'd feel a kind of emptiness, a hollow ache in your soul. Tavern was quiet, but the sad music of his words still played in your head. The smell of stale ale and human sorrow was a permanent perfume. You'd look at the empty chairs, and you'd wonder if you too were a kind of ghost. The weight of that knowledge was a heavy price to pay, and it was a price you paid every single day. You know, in our world, we talk about reputation as something you can build and control. Crap. On. In the medieval era, for a barmaid, your reputation was a cage. You were judged constantly from every single angle by people who knew nothing about you and who cared even less. Your life was a public spectacle, and you were constantly on trial with no chance of a fair verdict. The cold, hard stare of a judging eye was a constant presence, a kind of phantom pain that never went away. The villagers gossiped. They'd see you walk down the street, and they'd whisper about you. She works at the tavern, they'd say. Goods. She must be a harlot. It didn't matter what you did, or how you acted. If you smiled too much, you were a harlot, a loose woman who was trying to attract men. If you frowned, you were rude, a person who was ungrateful for her job. The medieval barmaid was in a no-win situation. There was no way to act that would please them all. The sound of their whispers was a kind of background music to your life, a sad, constant hum of judgment. The priests condemned you. They'd preach from the pulpit about the sin of drunkenness, about the immorality of the tavern. They'd look at you with a kind of pity and disgust, as if you were a lost soul who was beyond redemption. You'd feel the weight of their words, a kind of spiritual burden that you had to carry with you every single day. The cold fear of damnation was a powerful deterrent. But you had to keep working. The texture of their robes, their pious faces, was a kind of a sad and lonely sight. The other patrons were no better. They'd come to the tavern to escape their own lives, but they would still judge you for yours. A man might get drunk and tell you about his wife, and then the next day he'd act like he didn't know you. The hypocrisy was a kind of bitter flavour that you had to swallow with every single drink you served. You were a servant, a listener, a receptacle for their sorrow, but you were never their equal. The barmaid was always wrong. If a customer was angry, it was your fault. If a mug was broken, it was your fault. If the ale was sour, it was your fault. You were the scapegoat for everything that went wrong. The weight of all that blame was a heavy burden, a kind of physical pain that you had to carry with you every single day. The cold reality was that no one cared about you, your feelings, or your side of the story. You were a kind of pariah, an outcast in your own village. You were surrounded by people, but you were fundamentally alone. The only solace was the silent solidarity between you and the other barmaids, a kind of unwritten understanding that you were all in it together. You'd share a knowing glance, a small gesture of understanding, and you'd get back to work. The loneliness. It was a profound and crushing thing. You'd walk home at night, the cold of the air on your skin, and you'd feel a kind of crushing emptiness. You were so alone, surrounded by so many people, and yet you felt like the only person in the world. The cold fear of being judged, of being seen as a thing and not a person, was a constant living thing in the pit of your stomach. You'd find yourself dreaming of a different life, a life where you were free, where you didn't have to worry about what others thought of you. You'd imagine a small house with a garden where you could grow your own food, where you could close the door and feel safe. The scent of a clean kitchen, a warm fire, a life without fear. It was a fantasy, a beautiful lie. You told yourself to get through the night. The longing for it was a sharp, poignant pain. The medieval barmaid was a kind of anti-hero. She wasn't fighting dragons or saving kingdoms. She was fighting a much harder battle. The battle against judgment, the battle against despair, the battle against a world that didn't care about her. Her victories were small, her wounds were invisible, and her story was often untold. You would find yourself talking to the empty air, to the silent mugs and tables, a kind of sad confessional. You tell them about your pain, your loneliness, your fears. The sound of your voice, low and quiet, was the only thing that filled the air. It was a kind of strange comfort, a way to feel a little less alone. And the taste of shame. It was a bitter flavour that never went away. It was a part of every meal you ate, every drink you served, every smile you faked. The shame of being a pawn in someone else's game, of having no control over your own life, was a kind of physical pain, a slow and painful burn that left you hollow. As you'd clean up the last of the debris, you'd look at the table where the regulars usually sat. The space would feel strangely hollow. You'd feel the cold of the mop handle in your hands, and you'd wonder if you too were a kind of ghost. The weight of that knowledge was a heavy price to pay, and it was a price you paid every single day. The sun would soon rise, and the cycle would begin again, bringing with it a whole new set of judgments. You know how we get spooked by ghost stories, right? Kind of thing you'd tell around a campfire for a cheap thrill. For a medieval barmaid, that was just a regular Tuesday night. These old inns weren't just places to drink. They were ancient buildings that had seen centuries of life, and, more importantly, centuries of death. A creak in the floorboards wasn't just a sign of an old building. It was a sign that you weren't alone. You were a living person, and you were constantly serving the dead. The cold air on the back of your neck was a kind of a sad and lonely reminder. The patrons loved the stories. They'd huddle around the fire, their faces lit by the flickering flames, and they'd whisper tales of a knight who was murdered in his sleep, a travelling merchant who never left, a child who cried in the walls. These were entertainment, a kind of grim humour to pass the time. But for you, they were a terrifying reality. You knew where the strange footsteps came from. You knew why the mugs would move on their own, and you knew who was whispering your name in the dead of the night. The sound of their voices, low and conspiratorial, was a kind of background music to your life, a sad, constant hum of fear. The fear was a constant living thing in the pit of your stomach. You'd be serving a drink, and a sudden chilling whisper would come from an empty corner. You'd feel a cold dread, a kind of phantom chill that made you shiver. You'd have to pretend you didn't hear it, that you didn't feel a presence behind you, even when the hair on the back of your neck stood on end. The medieval barmaid was a kind of a ghost herself, a person who had to live with the dead and pretend they weren't there. You'd have to serve with a blank face, a kind of vacant smile, even when you were terrified. You had to keep pouring, keep smiling, keep the illusion of normalcy alive. The cold of the mug in your hand was a constant reminder of the physical world, a kind of anchor that kept you from floating away into madness. The silence that followed a sudden sound was always the loudest part, a kind of deafening stillness that was more terrifying than any scream. You were a kind of reluctant medium, a person who was forced to communicate with the dead. They would come to you with their stories, their secrets, and their pain. They would whisper to you about the lives they once had, the loves they lost, the injustices they suffered. The weight of their sorrows was a heavy burden, a kind of emotional baggage you had to carry with you every single day. The smell of the old dusty wood and the damp earth was a kind of perfume, a low musty scent that never went away. The tavern was a place of ghosts, a repository for all the stories that were never told, all the lives that were cut short. You were a silent witness to it all, a kind of living historian who had to remember every single death, every single tragedy. The barmaid was a keeper of secrets, a person who knew the truth about the lives that were lived and lost within those walls. The loneliness, it was a profound and crushing thing. You were surrounded by people, but you couldn't get close to any of them. You were so alone, surrounded by so many people, and yet you felt like the only person in the world. The cold fear of the unknown was a constant living thing in the pit of your stomach, a kind of a sad and lonely dread. You'd find yourself dreaming of a different life, a life where you were free, where you didn't have to worry about the dead. You'd imagine a small house with a garden where you could grow your own food, where you could close the door and feel safe. The scent of a clean kitchen, a warm fire, a life without fear. It was a fantasy, a beautiful lie you told yourself to get through the night. The longing for it was a sharp, poignant pain. The medieval barmaid was a kind of anti-hero. She wasn't fighting dragons or saving kingdoms. She was fighting a much harder battle. The battle against fear, the battle against despair, the battle against a world that didn't care about her. Her victories were small, her wounds were invisible, and her story was often untold. You would find yourself talking to the empty air, to the silent mugs and tables, a kind of sad confessional. You tell them about your pain, your loneliness, your fears. The sound of your voice, low and quiet, was the only thing that filled the air. It was a kind of strange comfort, a way to feel a little less alone. And the taste of shame, it was a bitter flavour that never went away. It was a part of every meal you ate, every drink you served, every smile you faked. The shame of being a pawn in someone else's game, of having no control over your own life, was a kind of physical pain, a slow and painful burn that left you hollow. As you'd clean up the last of the debris, you'd look at the table where the regulars usually sat. The space would feel strangely hollow. You'd feel the cold of the mop handle in your hands, and you'd wonder if you too were a kind of ghost. The weight of that knowledge was a heavy price to pay, and it was a price you paid every single day. The sun would soon rise, and the cycle would begin again, bringing with it a whole new set of judgments. You know how you think of nobles as these fancy, sophisticated people who wouldn't be caught dead in a dirty tavern? Crap. Thought. The truth is, they'd come to drink, and when they did, it was a special kind of hell for you. They were a different breed of patron, a more dangerous kind of customer. They demanded royal treatment with peasant pay, and any mistake was met with swift, brutal punishment. The cold fear of their presence was a constant living thing in the pit of your stomach. They'd waltz in their fine clothes and shiny armour, a jarring contrast to the grime of the tavern. They'd look down their noses at you as if you were something they'd stepped in. The smell of their expensive perfumes and the rich velvety texture of their clothes was a kind of cruel torture, a reminder of the world you didn't belong to. They'd snap their fingers, their voices, a kind of arrogant music, and you'd have to jump to their every whim. And they were cheap. Oh, so cheap. They'd order the finest ale, the most expensive wine, and they'd pay you nothing. They'd assume their mere presence was enough of a reward. You'd serve them with grace and a smile, even while they were humiliating you. They'd make a rude comment, a lewd joke, and you'd have to just laugh it off. Your face, a blank canvas. The shame of it was a kind of physical pain, a slow and painful erosion of your dignity. Any mistake was punished, and sometimes violently. You might trip and spill a drop of wine, and they'd backhand you without a second thought. Cold shock of the blow, the sharp pain, the sudden silence of the other patrons. It was a terrifying experience. You couldn't fight back. You couldn't complain. The medieval barmaid was a kind of a human punching bag, a person who had to absorb all the violence and the anger and pretend it didn't happen. You were forced to serve with a kind of sad dignity, a quiet resilience in the face of their cruelty. You'd have to get down on your hands and knees and clean their vomit with your tears. The tavern was their playground, and you were just another piece of the scenery, a person who was there for their amusement. The taste of your own shame and your own tears was a kind of bitter flavour that never went away. The other patrons would go quiet when the nobles came. They'd watch, their faces a mixture of fear and resentment. They knew that their lives were cheap, and that a noble's whim was a matter of life and death. The silence was a kind of deafening stillness, a kind of shared fear that was more terrifying than any scream. The noble was a kind of a sad and lonely figure. They were so powerful, and yet they came to a dirty tavern to escape their own lives. They were a kind of ghost, a person who was so disconnected from their own humanity that they had to find a way to feel something, anything. The sound of their forced laughter, their loud booming voices, was a kind of tragic symphony. You'd find yourself dreaming of a different life, a life where you were free, where you didn't have to worry about powerful men. You'd imagine a small house with a garden, where you could grow your own food, where you could close the door and feel safe. The scent of a clean kitchen, a warm fire, a life without fear. It was a fantasy, a beautiful lie. You told yourself to get through the night. The longing for it was a sharp, poignant pain. The medieval barmaid was a kind of anti-hero. She wasn't fighting dragons or saving kingdoms. She was fighting a much harder battle. The battle against cruelty, the battle against despair, the battle against a world that didn't care about her. Her victories were small, her wounds were invisible, and her story was often untold. You would find yourself talking to the empty air, to the silent mugs and tables, a kind of sad confessional. You'd tell them about your pain, your loneliness, your fears. The sound of your voice, low and quiet, was the only thing that filled the air. It was a kind of strange comfort, a way to feel a little less alone. And the taste of shame. It was a bitter flavour that never went away. It a part of every meal you ate, every drink you served, every smile you faked. The shame of being a pawn in someone else's game, of having no control over your own life, was a kind of physical pain, a slow and painful burn that left you hollow. As you clean up the last of the debris, you'd look at the table where the nobles sat. The space would feel strangely hollow. You'd feel the cold of the mop handle in your hands, and you'd wonder if you, too, were a kind of ghost. The weight of that knowledge was a heavy price to pay, and it was a price you paid every single day. The sun would soon rise, and the cycle would begin again, bringing with it a whole new set of humiliations. You know how in our world, people talk about a career, a long-term plan with a pension and a retirement fund? For a medieval barmaid, your career was a fleeting, desperate sprint. You were a piece of fruit on the vine, and once you started to shrivel, you were replaced. Youth equaled value. Wrinkles equaled rejection. Your retirement plan was either poverty or a slow, painful return to the life you tried to escape. Your body was your most valuable asset. The young, fresh-faced girl with rosy cheeks and a quick smile was the one who got the tips, who attracted the patrons. But with every passing year, the physical demands of the job, the constant stress, the lack of proper nourishment, it all started to show. Your hands would be raw and chapped. Your eyes would have dark circles, and a kind of deep, bone-weary exhaustion would settle into your very posture. You were a barmaid whose body was a ticking clock, and the moment the tavern owner noticed you were done, there was no notice, no final paycheck, no thank you for your service. He'd just hire a younger, prettier girl, and you'd be out on the street. The cold fear of that was a constant living thing in the pit of your stomach. You'd have to fight the urge to look at your face in the cracked glass, to see the signs of your own slow decay. The feel of the cold draft on your back, a kind of pre-emptive exile, was a terrifying reminder of your impending doom. The emotional toll of it was immense. You'd see a new young girl come in, and you'd feel a kind of resentful pity. You knew her story, you knew what she would have to go through, and you also knew that her fate would be yours someday. The smell of her fresh, youthful skin was a kind of macabre perfume, a kind of sad and lonely reminder of the person you once were. You were a ghost in your own life, a person who was slowly fading away. You had no savings, no pension, no plan for the future. The little money you made was just enough to get by, and there was nothing left over. You couldn't save for a better life, because there was no better life to save. The cold reality was that you were trapped in a cycle of poverty and despair, and there was no way out. The only way to survive was to keep working, to keep fighting. You'd have to find a new tavern, a place that might be more lenient, or you'd have to find another job entirely. Towards death. But the skills of a barmaid, the ability to deal with drunks, the art of deflecting a hand, the strength to carry heavy buckets, didn't translate into a better life. You were a person with a very specific and very limited skill set. The loneliness, it was a profound and crushing thing. You'd see the other barmaids, the ones who had been there for a long time, their faces etched with the same weary exhaustion, and you'd feel a kind of sad solidarity. You were all in it together, trapped in the same grim reality. You'd share a knowing glance, a small gesture of understanding, and you'd get back to work. The fear of aging, of losing your value, was a kind of a dark shadow that followed you everywhere. You'd be serving a drink, and a sudden thought would flash in your mind. What if this was your last day? What if tomorrow you'd be out in the street? The cold dread of that possibility was a powerful motivator, a kind of fear that made your blood run cold. You'd find yourself dreaming of a different life. A life where you were free, where you didn't have to worry about your age. You'd imagine a small house with a garden where you could grow your own food, where you could close the door and feel safe. The scent of a clean kitchen, a warm fire, a life without fear. It was a fantasy, a beautiful lie you told yourself to get through the night. The longing for it was a sharp, poignant pain. The medieval barmaid was a kind of anti-hero. She wasn't fighting dragons or saving kingdoms. She was fighting a much harder battle, the battle against time, the battle against despair, the battle against a world that didn't care about her. Her victories were small, her wounds were invisible, and her story was often untold. You would find yourself talking to the empty air, to the silent mugs and tables, a kind of sad confessional. You tell them about your pain, your loneliness, your fears. The sound of your voice, low and quiet, was the only thing that filled the air. It was a kind of strange comfort, a way to feel a little less alone. As you'd clean up the last of the debris, you'd feel a kind of emptiness, a hollow ache in your soul. The tavern was quiet, but the sad music of your own fading youth still played in your head. The smell of stale ale and human sorrow was a permanent perfume. You'd look at your hands rough and chapped, and you'd wonder if they could ever be clean again. The weight of that knowledge was a heavy price to pay, and it was a price you paid every single day. And so we've come to the end of our journey, but the echoes of her story will stay with you long after the video is over. Her life wasn't a fairy tale. It was a brutal, unseen battlefield, fought not with swords and shields, but with mops and ale mugs. The medieval barmaid was an unsung hero, whose daily struggle was a testament to the quiet resilience of the human spirit. She survived the filth, the fear, and the relentless dehumanization, carrying the weight of a world on her shoulders. She was a witness to all its ugliness, but her endurance proves that even in the grimmiest corners of history dignity can be found. Her story isn't just about survival. It's a profound work of art, a reflection on what it means to truly persevere when the world has given you every reason to give up. So let me ask you, what part of her story resonated most deeply with you? Does her quiet strength change your perspective on the grand heroes we read about in history books? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this conversation. If you were impacted by her story and want to keep exploring the hidden human narratives that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications. Until next time,